Hello, everyone. My name is Tammy Rose, and I'm here to take you on a journey to a Far Azore. This presentation is about the island of Faial, as well as a whole bunch of transcendentalists that you may or may not have heard of. All right, so to introduce myself a little bit further, I run an online group and everything is based on a website essentially called transcendentalconquered.org. There you can find the links for the Facebook group that has the same name, a YouTube series that I run called Conquered Days. We do a whole bunch of online book groups. And I'm also doing a podcast where I read Walden and I offer some commentary about the pond and the town. So where does the quote, "a Far Azore," come from? For those of you Thoreauvians who think that it sounds vaguely familiar, yes, it's from his first published book called "A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers" that he wrote dedicating it to his brother. It's essentially about a canoe trip that they took for 2 weeks. And in these first few lines, he's talking about being bound for a distant shore, a lonely isle of Far Azore. And that means that he was aware of the Azores as a bunch of islands. It's actually very funny that he should use that in the singular. I've never heard it in the singular. And my family is from there. On the right side of the screen, you'll see a bunch of lines that are actually in Brazilian Portuguese. Carolina, who's also in this session, is translating this book into Brazilian Portuguese. And she's doing a really beautiful job. And if we're lucky during the Q&A, we can get her to read these lines. All right, so how far away are the Azores? They're only actually about 4 hours if you take a plane, but if you're sailing, it can take between 2 to 4 weeks. As you can see, they're pretty much a straight shot between Boston and Portugal. And they're about, I don't know, 3/4 of the way. Really, there are no other islands in that area. They are created because it's a meeting of 3 different tectonic plates that cause the formation. They're volcanic and they have lots of eruptions and volcanic activity on a regular basis. So there are 9 of them. The 2 islands that I'm really going to talk about are Faial and Pico. In the 1800s, really, why would you visit them? Yes, we know about whaling. You might go for trade. It's a stopover. They're very strategically placed in the middle of the Atlantic by themselves. And the number one reason really is health. And here's a quote from Thoreau talking about what his doctor is recommending him to do. It tells him he must clear out, and I decide against the south of Europe on account of the expense of time and money. If any of you have read the book Westward I Go Free, that you'll know that he goes to Minnesota instead. But lots of his friends and lots of transcendentalists and lots of rich people of the day went to the islands, and very specifically Faial. And we'll find out why in a few moments. Before I get into that whole history thing, I want to share my personal connection. Here is a picture of my mother at age 2. And she was always telling me that she grew up next door to a beautiful fancy house in Horta, Faial. Horta is the main port of all the 9 islands, or at least it was in the mid-1800s. And she would tell me stories of how she would climb the tree to pick these beautiful pieces of fruit called nishparish. In English, we call them loquats. And the note on the back of this photo is Fatima Freitage eating a nishpara, spring of 1942-43 on the steps of the orchard above. All right. And my mother passed away last year, but in every previous Thoreau presentation, I brought her in to recite some piece in Portuguese. So I'm very happy that I could bring her along with me, even though she's passed. All right, so she is sitting on the steps of this building. I think these steps down in front. This was called Bagatelle, and it belonged to the Dabney family. They were American consuls in Horta, and they were Bostonian high society. The Dabney family was 3 generations of consuls, starting from 1806 and pretty much lasting until the end of the century. John Bass Dabney, the grandfather, the eldest of them all, wanted to trade in wine in France early in the 1800s. He decided actually the Azores were much, much more amenable because there was a war going on in France, things like that. And then he brought his whole family over, and he was eventually appointed consul to America. When he died, his son Charles took over, and the grandson Samuel took over from him. Now, it's nice to know about politics, blah, 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 but historians and researchers actually want to know about the details of how people lived. So we have Roxana Lewis Dabney to thank. She's Charles's daughter. She actually was the writer, editor, and historian. She compiled letters, journals, photos, 1,500 pages of family history, and has published a book, and it's been published in Portuguese. And at first she just published it for her family, thinking that nobody else would be interested. But when it turns out the long list of guests that they entertained at that at Bagatelle, and the stories turn out to be much more interesting. All right, so here is a view, 1842, like 100 years before that picture of my mother. This is what the sleepy little town of Horta actually looked like. This is courtesy of the New Bedford Whaling Museum. New Bedford is one of those towns where a lot of people from the Azores emigrated to. Nantucket, Toronto in Canada, California also has a lot of people from the Azores or Azorians. Also more locally, Lowell and Cambridge. And one of the things I wanted to point out were all of the ships in the harbor. So you can see that it's a very active trading post. All right, so who visited the Azores? Everybody from Samuel Longfellow, who was a tutor for the family. He was Henry Wadsworth's brother. Thomas Starr King, who might be known to some of you as a Unitarian minister who made his name in California and San Francisco. Even J.P. Morgan. Now, I'm not counting J.P. Morgan as a transcendentalist, but I think it's really interesting that he is sort of linked through all of these things. He visited in the in 1852, and he eventually started a financial company called Dabney Morgan and Company, which lasted from 1864 to 1871. And as soon as he dissolved that, he started J.P. Morgan, which is now J.P. Morgan Chase. So you have a sense of the level of high society that the Dabneys were still in touch with from their Boston roots. Also, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, William Morris Hunt, who's a painter, Mark Twain in Innocents Abroad. We're going to get into all of that. Cyrus Bartol, who's a little bit more obscure, but he's a hymnist. Ellen Tucker Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson's daughter. She visited for a few years. And Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts, who, if you don't know, I'm going to introduce you to. All right, so starting with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, we're going to skip some of the names that I offered. In case his name rings a bell, you might know him because he's Unitarian minister, member of the Secret Six. He helped Emily Dickinson. He was her first editor. And if none of those ring a bell, then he was captain of the 51st Massachusetts in the Civil War. He was essentially the Zelig. He was everywhere in the 1800s. And he was also in Faial. He visited from October 1855 to May 1856 for his wife's health. And who was his wife? Mary Channing Higginson, the sister of Ellery, who was Thoreau's best friend, one of Thoreau's best friends. And in 1860, he published an article called Faial and the Portuguese in the Atlantic. And it's a very beautiful article. Here is a quote from Thoreau's journal. Of course, this is something that Thoreau would be interested in. Higginson told me yesterday of a large tract near Faial and near Pico covered with reindeer. The first time I read this, I was like, reindeer? I've never seen reindeer in Faial. What is he talking about? He's talking about lichens. He's talking about moss, very remarkable and desolate, extending for miles because of the effect of an earthquake. So that's kind of a recurring theme, earthquakes and seismic activities, which give birth to all sorts of very weird creatures and moss and lichens. And this picture has a whole bunch of them. I believe the reindeer lichen he's referring to is stuff that's all the way in the bottom right-hand corner that has like antlery looking to it. All right. And then this is another piece. So the end of that quote is the beginning of this quote. They talk at length about the force of the wind on the summit of Pico. Higginson is mentioning that to Thoreau because he knows that Thoreau has climbed many a mountain himself. And so it's interesting that they would have that conversation in 1857. The article about that was published in the Atlantic doesn't come until 1860. And the phrase that he uses to describe it, Higginson says, "We waked next morning after camping halfway up the mountain. We wake next morning above the clouds with one vast floor of white, level vapor beneath us, such as Thoreau alone has described." I love that. So Samuel Longfellow, let's move on to him, visited for a while. He was a tutor for the Dabney children. He has as you'll notice, his life was happening kind of parallel to Thoreau's in terms of the timeline. Longfellow was born in 1819. So he's just 2 years off from what Thoreau is doing. His letter to Edward Everett Hale talks about what it's like to go on vacation with the family that you're tutoring. I might tell you of the delightful October, which we spent at Pico, how we bathed in the surf in the morning and took long strolls in the afternoon and virtuously read Portuguese in the evening. Now, this strikes me just that you can swim in the ocean in October. I think I've done that once or twice on the Cape, but my mother has told me stories where she was swimming in the ocean on New Year's Day in Faial. And getting to his letter from his brother, who's trying to be the older brother, trying to like give him wise advice. "I'm publishing a book. If you've found anything pretty in the Portuguese, pray let me have it. Have you translated anything yet? Don't neglect this opportunity of learning the language thoroughly. You ought to speak it muito bem," very well by this time. It's always fun when poets are trying to speak other languages, and good for him. All right, so here is Pico, and this is a view directly from the garden of Bagatelle. So this is what they woke up to every morning. And this is what it looks like now. It's a giant, beautiful mountain. And I've stayed in Horta many, many times, and this view just blows you away every day. So, and getting to whaling, Melville had written Moby Dick and was very experienced in the ways of whaling. So he knew, and he ran into sailors from the Azores. This is from chapter 27 of Moby Dick. And I just want to say that my Azorean great-grandfather, I'm not sure how many greats, actually went to Hawaii twice by the tip of South America. So he went the hard way. Whaling essentially ended as a practice legally in 1986. And right now it's a biologist paradise. Former processing buildings where they used to deal with whale oil are now all aquariums and hospitals for aquatic animals. All right, now we get to the Quaker City Steamship, which is the very first tourist trip in 1867. So when we talk about people going to Europe for their great education, and this is where you would send the kids after college, and that's when it really started. It was this first trip was sponsored by Henry Ward Beecher's Plymouth Church in Brooklyn. Henry Ward Beecher was Harriet Beecher Stowe's brother. And here's the response from the Dabney family when the ship arrives at the anchor. "Alice awoke me about 7 to let me know that she was at anchor. And at 10, the parlor was quite full. We took them all into the garden, and I never saw persons more delighted with flowers and etc. They seemed quite wild with enthusiasm. One young man has his notebook out all the time and remarked as I gave him some verbena, 'I am taking notes as I am a correspondent of a paper.' Horrors, how we may appear in print. and that's from Clara Pomeroy Dabney. The newspaper man that she is talking about is none other than Mark Twain. And this is in Innocents Abroad. This takes up all of chapter 6. And sadly, there's a little bit more of like the ugly American stereotype that he kind of, I don't know, he establishes the model for. Some of his lines are, I think the Azores must be very little known in America. And he kind of goes on very dismissively throughout the rest. People were like, oh, it's a group of 9 or 10 small islands, something like that, somewhere between New York and Gibraltar. That's all. These considerations moved me to put in a paragraph of dry facts just here. And one of the most insulting lines is, the community is eminently Portuguese. That is to say, it is slow, poor, shiftless, sleepy, and lazy. Ugh. It kills me that the people that ended up staying longer and they didn't write as much and maybe they didn't become quite as famous, those were the ones who could really appreciate the land and the flowers, and they weren't just staying as a quick stopover. I feel like Twain felt like he had to go out of his way to be extra cynical. I did find this lovely quote that, I think that he actually did have a good time. Like he says, it was fun scurrying around the breezy hills and through the beautiful canyons. Every time I go, I get a beautiful tour of the island because, you just go and you get in a car and you drive and it's amazing. There was that rare thing, novelty about it. It was a fresh, new, exhilarating sensation, this donkey riding, and worth 100 worn and threadbare home pleasures. And I absolutely resonate with, because I feel like it's a whole new experience. And Thomas Wentworth Higginson has written about that at length as well, about how everything is strange and you end up looking for something familiar that you actually recognize. But I love how Twain actually enjoyed riding around on donkeys. All right, because when Ellen Tucker Emerson came, they loved her so much that they actually sent her this donkey. This is her riding her donkey in Concord in front of the Emerson house. The donkey's name is Graciosa, by the way, which means graciousness. And in a letter back home when she was there, she writes about Little Women, which I think is very cool. Little Women has been sent out to me and I'm about to read it. I just lent it to the Dabney children and they enjoy it. Louisa has always been the most lively and original girl, and her 3 sisters were all bright and able to help her in all her schemes. And their childhood and youth were full of the most amazing and interesting works and plays. And Elizabeth Wentworth Roberts, if you don't know her, she founded Concord Art with Daniel Chester French. And these are from her trip from 1912. These are oil sketches and they're currently on exhibit. So this picture in the back, that's Bagatelle. And in front, this is my mother's house with some of her siblings. And this is a picture circa 1984. Muito obrigada. Thank you very much. Cheers.